January, Eastern Europe, 1475. The temperature has not risen above freezing in weeks. The Moldavian forest is locked in a silence so deep you can hear individual snowflakes settle on branches. And through that forest, down a narrow valley carved by a river called the Racova, the most feared military force on earth is marching north. They had already taken Constantinople. They had already swallowed Serbia, Bosnia, and most of the Balkans. They had dismantled 1,000 years of Christian civilization in a single afternoon in 1453, and in the 22 years since, no one, not a single European king, general, or coalition had stopped them. And now they were here, in this forgotten corner of Eastern Europe, coming for a principality most people in Paris or London had never heard of. Coming for a prince named Stephen, who ruled a country smaller than the state of Virginia. Stephen had no artillery. He had no walls strong enough to matter. He had no allies who had actually sent soldiers. He had farmers carrying spears and noblemen on horses, and a plan that required everything to go exactly right on a single winter morning. Here is what most people get wrong about the Battle of Vaslui. They think the fog won it. It didn't. The fog was the last layer, the last piece of a trap that had been under construction for months. A trap built from geography, psychology, logistics, and a brutally clear-eyed understanding of exactly how the Ottoman war machine worked and exactly where it broke. On the 10th of January, 1475, Stephen the Great of Moldavia led somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men into a battle against an Ottoman force that outnumbered them. Significantly, ancient sources say 4-1. Modern historians are more cautious, but even the most conservative estimates give the Ottomans a substantial edge in numbers, in equipment, in professional training, and in the confidence that comes from 2 decades of unbroken victory. By the end of that day, the Ottoman army was shattered. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were dying in the frozen forest, retreating south without food, without order, without commanders. The Beylerbey of Rumelia, the governor of the European half of the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful military figures in the world, was fleeing on horseback through the same valley he had entered that morning, with absolute certainty of victory. What happened in that valley was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was one of the most carefully engineered military outcomes of the 15th century. And almost no one in the Western world has ever heard of it. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why Stephen won, not the simplified version, not the folklore, but the actual mechanism. You will understand why the Ottoman army, for all its power, walked directly into a killing ground it never saw coming. You will understand what it cost, what it changed, and what it ultimately could not save. And you will understand why this story, one of the most remarkable military achievements of the medieval world, was quietly filed away in the margins of history, while lesser battles got monuments and textbooks. The answer to that last question might be the most important one of all. To understand what Stephen was up against, you need to understand what the Ottoman Empire actually was in 1475. Not the caricature, not the distant villain of a Hollywood movie, but the living, functioning, expanding organism that had been systematically consuming southeastern Europe for over a century. The Ottoman Empire did not expand because its rulers were uniquely cruel or uniquely ambitious. It expanded because it was structurally built to expand. Its economy was organized around conquest. New territories meant new tax revenues, new tribute payments, new populations from which to recruit soldiers. The Janissary system, which we will come back to, literally required a constant supply of conquered children to function. Stop expanding, and the entire machine begins to starve itself. This was not greed. This was the metabolism of an empire. By 1475, that metabolism had consumed an extraordinary amount of the known world. In 1453, Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, had ended the Byzantine Empire with a siege that the entire Christian world had watched and done almost nothing about. Constantinople, the city that had stood for 1100 years as the eastern bastion of Christian civilization, fell in 53 days. Mehmed rode through the Hagia Sophia while it was still full of refugees who had fled there believing God would not let it fall. In the years after Constantinople, the pace did not slow. Serbia fell in 1459. The Despotate of Morea, the last fragment of Byzantine Greece, fell in 1460. Bosnia fell in 1463. Trebizond, the last Byzantine successor state on the Black Sea coast, fell in 1461. Albania was in the process of being absorbed. The Hungarian frontier was under constant pressure. Venice was fighting desperately to hold its Aegean outposts and losing them one by one. Every year, the boundary of the Ottoman world moved north and west. Every year, the space between the Sultan's armies and the heart of Central Europe shrank. And every year, the Christian kingdoms of Europe held councils, wrote letters, proclaimed crusades, and sent each other's ambassadors home with promises instead of soldiers. Into this world, Moldavia occupied a position of extraordinary geopolitical significance and extraordinary geopolitical vulnerability. It was a principality wedged between three competing powers: Ottoman Turkey to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary to the west, and the Kingdom of Poland to the north. Whoever controlled Moldavia controlled the land corridor between the Black Sea and the Carpathian, passes the route through which armies had moved from the steppe into the heart of Europe for 1,000 years. It was, in the language of modern strategists, the kind of territory that everyone wants to use and no one wants to defend. In theory, Moldavia was an Ottoman tributary. It was supposed to pay an annual sum to Constantinople in exchange for being allowed to exist. In practice, Stephen III, Stephen the Great, as he would eventually be called, had spent the better part of his reign refusing to behave like a tributary. He had pursued his own alliances. He had sought relationships with Hungary and Poland. He had built fortresses. He had reorganized his military. And in 1473 and 1474, he had done something that made a military confrontation essentially unavoidable. He had attacked Wallachia. Wallachia was the principality to Moldavia's south, between Moldavia and the Ottoman frontier. It was governed by a ruler who had been installed by Ottoman authority and who reliably served Ottoman interests. Stephen invaded, removed that ruler, and replaced him with a man loyal to Moldavia. It was a direct challenge to Ottoman control of the northern buffer zone. It was the kind of act that, in the Ottoman system, could not go unanswered without sending a message of weakness to every other reluctant vassal from the Danube to the Danube Delta. Mehmed II understood this. He ordered Hadim Suleiman Pasha, the Bey of Rumelia, the highest Ottoman military official in Europe, to take a substantial force into Moldavia, remove Stephen, restore Ottoman authority, and demonstrate to the entire frontier that defiance had consequences. Now, here is the man Suleiman Pasha was being sent to remove. Stephen III had come to the throne of Moldavia in 1457, which means that by the time of Vaslui he had been ruling for 18 years. He had not inherited the throne peacefully. He had taken it by force, defeating and killing his predecessor in battle. He had spent the first years of his reign eliminating rivals boyars, the Moldavian nobility, who had their own ambitions and their own networks of loyalty. Some of these men he stripped of their lands. Some he executed. He was not a beloved king in the sentimental sense. He was a king people obeyed because he had demonstrated repeatedly that the alternative was worse. But he was also genuinely competent in ways that went beyond raw ruthlessness. In 18 years he had built something. He had built a state that functioned, that collected taxes reliably, that maintained roads and fortresses, that could actually mobilize its population for war. When he called the Ostia Mare, The Great Army, the Moldavian equivalent of a national levy, where every able-bodied man in the country was called to fight people, came, not because they loved Stephen necessarily, because they understood what was at stake. In late 1474, when it became clear that Suleiman Pasha was assembling a major force and that the invasion was coming, Stephen did what any prudent statesman would do. He wrote to his neighbours. He wrote to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. He wrote to King Casimir IV of Poland. He wrote to Pope Sixtus IV in Rome. The letters were not panicked appeals for help. They were careful strategic arguments. If Moldavia falls, Stephen wrote, the next line of Christian defence is Hungary. If Hungary weakens, the road to Vienna opens. Help me now, and you protect yourself later. The responses he received were, in the diplomatic language of the era, encouraging. In practical terms, they were useless. Letters arrived, promises were made. No soldiers came. Stephen put the letters away and went back to planning. There is something worth pausing on here before we move to the preparation itself, something that defines who Stephen was and why this battle unfolded the way it did. Most rulers in his position, facing an Ottoman army of the size that Suleiman was assembling, would have had two obvious options: surrender and negotiate the best terms possible, or retreat behind the strongest available walls and wait for relief that might never come. Both of those options had the advantage of being passive, of not requiring you to make a catastrophically wrong decision that loses everything in an afternoon. Stephen chose a third option. He decided to fight in the open field, in winter, on ground of his own choosing, and destroy the Ottoman force before it could be reinforced or resupplied. Not hold it off. Not survive it. Destroy it. This was not optimism. Stephen was not an optimistic man. This was calculation. He had studied how Ottoman campaigns worked. He understood their logistics, their command structure, their strengths, and critically, the specific ways those strengths became liabilities in the wrong terrain and the wrong weather. He had a theory about how to win, and he was willing to bet Moldavia on it. The preparation that followed that decision is the part of this story that most retellings skip over. They skip to the fog, to the ambush, to the numbers. But the fog was just the final brushstroke on a painting that had been in progress for months. Start with the force Stephen was building, because understanding what he had and what he did not have is the only way to understand why the battle had to be fought exactly the way it was. The Moldavian military in 1475 was not a professional army in the Ottoman sense. It had a corps of professional fighters, the Curteni, the noble cavalry, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 men who were trained, mounted, equipped with good weapons and armor, and experienced in actual combat. These were Stephen's most reliable soldiers. They had fought with him for 18 years. They understood his methods. They would not break easily. But the rest of the force, the austere mare, the great national levy, was something different. These were farmers, craftsmen, village priests young enough to carry a spear, merchants who had never been in a battle. They were called because Stephen needed numbers, and because the law allowed him to call them, and because for a decision this large there was no choice but to use them. When he rang the bell that summoned the austere mare, he was acknowledging openly that this was an existential fight. You only called the entire nation to arms when you genuinely could not afford to lose. The levy also included some mercenary units, settlers from Transylvania, ethnic Hungarians with significant experience fighting in the Ottoman borderlands, and possibly a small number of Polish troops. These professionals gave the mass of the levy a stiffening it badly needed. The weapons this force carried were not sophisticated. Bows, traditional recurve bows, the kind that could be fired quickly from horseback or from a fixed position in forest cover. Spears and pikes, hand weapons, axes, maces, short swords. Some of the noble cavalry had heavier armor and longer weapons, but there was essentially no artillery, no cannon. In 1475, Cannon were what had given the Ottomans their decisive edge at Constantinople, the ability to reduce walls that no previous army could breach. Stephen had none. What this meant, tactically, was stark. A Moldavian army could not fight the Ottomans on a flat, open field. On flat ground with room to maneuver, Ottoman cavalry would flank and encircle. Ottoman numbers would eventually overwhelm. Ottoman janissaries, the professional corps of the Sultan's infantry, were disciplined in a way that untrained levies almost never were. They would hold their formation under pressure that would scatter ordinary soldiers. On open ground, an Ottoman force of the size Suleiman was bringing would simply grind Stephen's army into the earth. So there could be no open ground. The entire strategy had to be built around creating a battlefield where Ottoman strengths became irrelevant. Now consider what the Ottomans were bringing, and more importantly consider what it cost them to bring it. Suleiman Pasha commanded a force that ancient and contemporary sources describe in numbers ranging from 30,000 to 120,000. Modern historians tend to be skeptical of the upper figures, which is reasonable medieval and early modern sources, routinely inflated enemy numbers, and the Ottoman army moving through winter terrain in eastern Moldavia would have faced severe logistical constraints on how many men it could actually feed and supply. A reasonable modern estimate puts the Ottoman force at somewhere between 30 and 40,000 effective fighting men. This is still a significant numerical advantage over what Stephen could field. The Ottoman force included janissaries, the elite infantry who were, in many ways, the most impressive professional soldiers in the world at that time. The janissary system was one of the Ottoman Empire's most distinctive and most powerful institutions. Boys were taken from Christian families in conquered territories, usually between the ages of 8 and 12, through a system called devshirm, the levy of children. These boys were converted to Islam, educated in Ottoman military discipline, and trained for years before they ever saw combat. They had no family loyalties that might conflict with their loyalty to the Sultan. They had no civilian life to return to. The military was everything they had. This produced soldiers of extraordinary discipline and cohesion. A janissary unit did not rout easily. It did not collapse under the normal psychological pressure that dissolved most medieval armies. It held. The Ottoman cavalry, both the heavy sipahi, who were provincial cavalry equipped for direct shock combat, and the lighter akunji, who served as screens and raiders, were formidable on open terrain. Sipahi charges had broken formations at every major Ottoman engagement for decades. The Akunja could range ahead of the main force, strip the countryside of resources, and prevent the enemy from concentrating. And then there were the guns. Ottoman artillery had become the terror of European armies since Constantinople. The great bombards that Mehmed had commissioned to crack the Byzantine walls were the most powerful weapons in the world at the time. Lighter field cannon, used to break enemy formations before the infantry closed, were standard Ottoman equipment by the 1470s. Here is the crucial detail that Stephen had worked out. None of those advantages would function in the terrain he was planning to use. The Racova Valley is a narrow corridor in eastern Moldavia, running roughly north to south, with the Racova River cutting through the low ground and dense forest rising on both sides. In January, the low ground is a mixture of frozen mud and unreliable ice, hard enough to walk on in some places, treacherous in others. The valley is narrow enough that a large force cannot deploy in line abreast. It must move in column, strung out along the valley floor, unable to bring its full width to bear at any given point. This is fatal to cavalry. Sipahi heavy cavalry needed room to build up speed, to swing wide, to strike from an angle. In the Racova Valley, there was no room. Horses moving in column on icy, muddy ground were slow, ungainly, and vulnerable. They could not charge effectively. They could barely maneuver. It was equally fatal to artillery. Ottoman cannon required flat, stable ground and clear sightlines. In the Racova Valley, the trees came to within meters of the trail. The ground was uneven and soft. Moving cannon through that terrain would have required days of engineering work that Suleiman's army had not planned for. The guns were essentially useless. And the forest on both sides? The forest was Stephen's. He had chosen this valley specifically because he knew it. He had grown up in this country. His commanders had hunted in these forests, had travelled these roads in every season. They knew where the ice was solid and where it would give way. They knew which slopes were gentle enough to move troops through silently and which were too steep. They knew that in January, in the low ground of this particular valley, the temperature differential between the frozen earth and the slightly warmer air coming down from the forested slopes produced fog, dense, low-lying, persistent morning fog that could reduce visibility to the length of a man's outstretched arm. Stephen did not hope for fog. He chose terrain where fog was nearly inevitable. But the geography was only one element of the preparation. Months before the Ottoman army crossed into Moldavia, Stephen had begun the other pieces of the trap. The first was what military historians call scorched earth, but Stephen's version was more surgical than the term usually implies. He did not simply burn everything. He destroyed specific things: grain stores that Ottoman cavalry horses would have needed, fodder for pack animals, food supplies in the villages along the most likely Ottoman route of march. He left enough that his own forces could live off the land. He destroyed enough that Suleiman's army would be moving through a landscape that could not sustain it. An army that is cold, hungry, and watching its horses weaken is an army that makes mistakes. The second element was harassment. For weeks before the decisive engagement, small Moldavian cavalry units, fast, lightly equipped, completely at home in the terrain, had been raiding the Ottoman advance. They struck at night. They shot from the tree line and vanished before a response could be organized. They killed messengers, captured scouts, and deprived Suleiman of reliable intelligence about what was ahead of him. They were not trying to stop the Ottoman advance. They were trying to tire it, to frustrate it, to make the soldiers irritable and the commanders uncertain. An army that has been under constant low-level harassment for weeks arrives at the decisive engagement already degraded not in numbers, but in alertness, confidence, and the clarity of judgment that good decisions require. The third element was the positioning of the main force. The night before the battle, Moldavian units moved into their designated positions in the forest, on both sides of the Racova Valley. They moved quietly, in small groups, well before first light. By the time the Ottoman advance guard entered the valley, thousands of archers and infantry were already in place, invisible in the dark forest, waiting. The final element, the one that would provide the psychological shock to complement the physical ambush, was sound. Stephen had organized musicians, drummers, and horn players, distributed across multiple positions on both sides of the valley. When the signal came, they would all play at once, from every direction simultaneously. In open terrain, this would have been dramatic but not decisive. In dense fog, with no visual reference whatsoever, a massive, coordinated eruption of sound from multiple unseen directions would make it functionally impossible for an Ottoman soldier to know where to face, where the threat was coming from, or how large the force surrounding him actually was. Stephen was not giving his soldiers better weapons or more armor. He was engineering an environment where the Ottoman army's discipline and training, which were genuine and formidable, would be disabled before the first arrow flew. On the night of January 9th, 1,475 thousands of Moldavian men, most of them farmers, most of them never having fought in a battle of this scale, lay in the frozen forest and waited. Some of them had been lying there for hours already. The temperature was well below freezing. They could not light fires. They could not make noise. They lay in the dark with their bows and their spears and their cold fear, and they waited for morning. Stephen knew the fog would come with the dawn. He had built everything else around that knowledge. The only variable he could not control was how his own men would hold when the moment arrived. He had done what he could to control it anyway. He had spent years building a reputation as a commander who won, who thought ahead, who did not waste lives on plans that hadn't been tested. The men in that forest had seen him win before. They had reasons, beyond simple loyalty, to believe that this plan was real and that it would work. Belief is not nothing in a military operation. It is, often, the difference between a unit that holds its position under extreme stress and a unit that breaks. The forest was silent. The temperature dropped, and the hours before dawn moved with the slowness that only extreme cold and extreme fear can produce. Phase 1. The Valley at Dawn. Dawn on January 10th arrived grey and cold and thick. The fog came in from the low ground, the way it always did in this valley, in this season not quickly, but inexorably, pooling first in the lowest parts of the terrain, then rising and spreading until the tree line on both sides had vanished and the visible world had contracted to a circle roughly 15 or 20 paces across. Sound moved strangely in fog, like this. It was muffled at some distances and oddly sharp at others. A man could not tell, from the sound of footsteps, whether another man was 30 yards away or 300. The Ottoman advance guard entered the Racova Valley in the early morning hours, well before full daylight. These were Akunji, the light cavalry raiders, who typically moved ahead of the main body to screen the route and report on conditions. Their job was to identify threats before the main army was exposed to them. In clear weather, on open ground, they were excellent at this job. In dense fog, in a narrow forested valley, their effectiveness was dramatically reduced. They could see only what was immediately in front of them. The forest on both sides was invisible, silent, apparently empty. They reported back. The valley appeared clear. Behind them, the main body of the Ottoman force began to enter the valley in column. This was unavoidable, the terrain forced it. There was no room to deploy in line. The Janissaries marched in the disciplined, measured way they always marched, keeping intervals, maintaining formation, even in the poor visibility. Behind them, the heavy Sipahi cavalry followed, horses picking their way carefully on the uneven, icy ground, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The column stretched back far enough that the rear elements had no idea what was happening at the front. Consider what this looks like from above, if you could somehow see through the fog. An Ottoman army that is genuinely formidable, genuinely disciplined, genuinely dangerous, moving in a long, thin line through a narrow corridor, unable to spread out, unable to see more than a few meters to either side, carrying artillery it cannot use, and riding horses that cannot charge, and surrounded on both sides by an enemy force that has been in position since before midnight. The trap is already closed. The Ottoman army does not know it yet. In the forest, on the eastern side of the valley, a Moldavian commander, we do not know his name, history did not record. It watches the column moving below through gaps in the trees and the fog. He can hear it more than see it. The creak of leather, the muffled clop of hooves on frozen ground, the occasional metallic sound of a weapon shifting against armor. The column is close. Close enough that he can hear individual voices. He waits for the signal. Phase 2. The horns in the fog. The signal, when it came, was unmistakable. From multiple positions, simultaneously, from the eastern forest, the western forest, and from positions ahead of the Ottoman advance, Moldavian horn players and drummers burst into sound. Not a single horn call, not the kind of organized military signal that armies use to coordinate maneuvers. This was a wall of sound, deliberately cacophonous, coming from every direction at once, amplified and distorted by the fog, into something that had no clear source and no clear meaning except this: you are surrounded. The effect on the Ottoman advance guard was immediate and severe. The Akunja horses, already nervous on the icy footing, reacted to the sudden noise the way horses react when they are frightened and cannot see the threat. Unpredictably, some reared. Some bolted sideways into the fog. The riders, fighting to control their mounts, lost their formation almost instantly. Within seconds, the advance guard had gone from a coherent military unit to a collection of individual men struggling with panicked horses in conditions of near-zero visibility. Behind them, the Janissary infantry heard the cacophony and did what they had been trained to do. They stopped and dressed their lines. This was the Janissary discipline in action. Instead of panicking, they halted and prepared to receive an attack. But here was the problem. You can dress a line against a threat you can see. You can orient your formation toward a danger you can identify. When the sound is coming from everywhere, when the fog makes it impossible to determine which direction the enemy is in, when you cannot see your own flanks, dressing a line accomplishes very little. The Janissaries stood in their disciplined formations, ready to fight, and had nothing to fight yet. And in that moment of disciplined, waiting uncertainty, the arrows began. The archers in the eastern forest went first, because the eastern slope gave a slightly better angle into the densest part of the Ottoman column. They had been holding their bows drawn for the past several minutes, since before the horns sounded, since the signal to prepare had been passed down the line in whispers, and when the order came, they released in near synchrony. Hundreds of arrows falling into a column that had no room to disperse. In the fog, the Janissaries in the column could not see where the arrows were coming from. They could hear the flight of the shafts, that particular sound, somewhere between a whisper and a hiss, but they could not determine the angle. Men fell. The column began to compress as soldiers instinctively moved toward the center of the trail, away from the tree line on both sides. Compressing made them a denser target. More arrows fell. On the western slope, Moldavian archers were doing the same thing. Now add one more element. The fog was not static. It moved. A gust of cold air would thin it slightly, allowing a glimpse, a suggestion of shapes, a hint of movement, and then close again before anything useful could be seen. This intermittent, almost visibility was, in some ways, worse than complete blindness. It kept men looking, kept them turning, kept them seeking the threat that was everywhere and nowhere. It consumed attention that should have been spent on fighting. Suleiman Pasha was somewhere in the middle of the column. He was receiving reports from the front, but the reports were fragmentary and contradictory. The fog destroyed communication as thoroughly as it destroyed formation. One messenger said the advance guard had been ambushed. Another said the enemy was on the right side. Another said they were retreating. Suleiman tried to issue orders. The orders travelled down the column slowly, getting distorted as they moved, arriving too late to matter for the situation they had been issued for. This was not incompetence on Suleiman's part. This was the fog doing what fog does to command and control. In any military operation, the speed at which orders travel is the speed at which the army can respond to changing conditions. Fog cut that speed to almost nothing. Suleiman was commanding an army he could neither see nor hear clearly, in a situation he could not fully understand, through a medium, the human messenger chain that was failing, under the pressure of noise, confusion, and fear. He had walked into a battlefield designed to make him blind. Pihes 3. The walls close. While the Ottoman column was absorbing the initial shock, the sound, the arrows, the invisible enemy on both sides, Stephen committed his main force. From the northern end of the valley, where the Ottoman column's advance guard had been heading, Moldavian forces attacked directly. This was the Curtany, the professional noble cavalry, along with the more experienced elements of the Ostermeer, moving on foot through terrain they had memorized in the darkness. Their job was not to destroy the Ottoman advance guard. Their job was to stop it, to seal the northern end of the valley, to prevent the Ottoman column from pushing through and emerging from the trap. At the same time, forces from both forest sides descended toward the valley floor, not in a single massed charge, but in the way you fight effectively in forest terrain, in multiple smaller groups, hitting different sections of the column simultaneously, maintaining contact with the trees long enough to use them for cover, striking, and then withdrawing slightly to avoid being encircled by the Ottoman response. The Ottoman soldiers found themselves in a situation that their training had not specifically prepared them for. Janissary discipline was built around the line engagement, the steady advance, the controlled volley, the bayonet charge into a formed enemy position. It worked magnificently in those conditions. It was almost useless here, where there was no line, no position, no formed enemy to advance against. There were men dying from arrows that came from everywhere. There were sounds of fighting on every side. There was fog. There were their own comrades, the men in other parts of the column, compressed and confused, making movement through the valley floor nearly impossible. The heavy Sipahi cavalry, which in almost any conventional engagement would have been the weapon that turned the battle, were essentially neutralized. A cavalry charge requires space to build momentum. It requires clear ground to cover. It requires the ability to see the target and the path to the target. In the Racova Valley on January 10th, none of those conditions existed. The horses were standing on ice and frozen mud, unable to move faster than a careful walk without risking a fall. Some horses did fall, brought down by the uneven ground, by the bodies of fallen men, by the weight of their own riders and equipment, and a fallen warhorse in the middle of a confined space creates an obstacle that cascades into further disorder. Artillery did not fire a single round. The gun crews were in the column. The guns themselves were useless in the fog and the trees. The most feared weapon in the Ottoman arsenal was, on this morning, dead weight. What Stephen had engineered was the near-complete cancellation of Ottoman advantages. The Ottomans had more men. In the narrow valley with forest on both sides, they could not bring their numbers to bear. The width of the fighting front was determined by the width of the valley, not by the total size of either army. The Ottomans had better equipped professional soldiers. In the fog, without clear lines of fire or clear targets, equipment mattered less than position, and position belonged to Moldavia. The Ottomans had cavalry. The terrain had made their cavalry into obstacles. The Ottomans had cannon. The trees and the fog had made their cannon irrelevant. What remained when you subtracted all of those advantages? Men on their feet, in a confined space, fighting hand to hand and being shot at from positions they could not see. And in that stripped-down version of combat, the Moldavians had the overwhelming advantage of knowing exactly where they were and where everything else was. The Ottomans did not. Consider what it meant to be a Janissary soldier in the middle of that column at the height of the fighting. You are trained. You are experienced. You have fought in actual battles. Your formation discipline is genuine, but you cannot see. You cannot hear commands clearly. You cannot tell which direction the enemy is concentrated. You can see men around you falling, and you cannot identify the source. You know intellectually that there are tens of thousands of men in this column with you, but in the immediate environment of fog and noise and trees, what you can perceive is a circle of maybe 30 feet, and within that circle, things are going very badly. The Janissary psychological training was designed to sustain soldiers under the pressure of conventional combat, the terrifying but comprehensible situation of enemy troops advancing against you across open ground. It was not designed for this. Nothing in the training prepared a soldier for the particular kind of terror produced by an enemy that cannot be seen, cannot be counted, and seems to be everywhere at once. The Ottoman front began to stall. The advance guard, which had been at the head of the column, was stopped by the Moldavian blocking force in the north. The middle sections of the column were taking fire from both sides. The rear sections were receiving confused and contradictory messages about what was happening ahead of them, and had begun to crowd forward anyway, compressing the column further and making movement even more chaotic. And then the line broke, not everywhere at once. It was more like a fracture propagating through a stressed material. A section of the advance guard, overwhelmed and unable to see relief coming, turned and began to push back toward the rear. When the men behind them saw this, when they saw the unit ahead of them, the unit that was supposed to be fighting forward, instead, coming at them in the fog and the smoke, they did not immediately understand what had happened. They saw men running toward them. That image, men from your own army running toward you, carries only one interpretation in a battle. It means the front has collapsed. It means the situation is worse than you knew. Fear, like fire, moves through a dense crowd much faster than information does. Phase 4. The collapse. The collapse of the Ottoman column was not instantaneous, and it was not complete all at once. That is important to understand, because what actually happened was, in many ways, more devastating than a simple rout. Suleiman Pasha still had disciplined units in his force. There were Janissary commanders who attempted to stabilize their sections of the line, who formed small defensive perimeters, who tried to create enough order to mount a coherent response. Some of them succeeded temporarily. Small groups of Ottoman soldiers held their ground in the fog, fighting back effectively, refusing to break. But they were islands, isolated pockets of discipline in a sea of dissolution, and the Moldavian forces did not have to defeat each of those pockets individually. They only had to prevent them from linking up with each other, from re-establishing communication, from reconstituting the command structure that would make them an army again rather than a collection of groups. Stephen's men moved through the trees and the fog with the ease of people who were entirely at home in this environment, cutting the communication lines between Ottoman units, picking off messengers, pushing isolated groups further into the forest or further down the valley, preventing any consolidation. And then there was the noise. The horns and drums had not stopped. They played throughout the battle the same cacophonous, omnidirectional sound that had started the engagement. By now, the Ottoman soldiers, who had not yet been in direct contact with enemy forces, had been listening to that sound for what felt like an eternity, unable to see anything, unable to understand what was happening, unable to determine whether the battle was going well or badly, or whether it was nearly over or had barely begun. Uncertainty, sustained long enough, has the same effect as fear. It wears people down. It causes them to make decisions they would not otherwise make to conserve themselves, to find a way out, to prioritize survival over mission in ways that individually seem rational, but collectively destroy an army's coherence. The order to retreat, if Suleiman actually issued a formal order, which is uncertain, it may have been a decision that emerged from the situation itself, rather than from a command travelled through the Ottoman force in the way that retreat orders always travel when an army is under serious stress. Faster than intended, interpreted more broadly than intended, amplified at each step by the terror of men who had found their own private reasons to believe it was the right thing to do. The Ottoman column reversed direction. Instead of moving north through the valley toward the Moldavian interior, it was now moving south, back toward Wallachia, back toward the frontier, back toward the Ottoman world. This reversal in a narrow valley, with fog still limiting visibility and the ground still treacherous, was its own form of disaster. Units that had been at the rear of the advancing column were now at the front of the retreating one. The careful spacing and intervals that military discipline maintained in a march were gone. Men were moving as fast as they could move in the conditions, which was not very fast at all, and Moldavian cavalry and infantry were pressing them from behind and from the sides. The retreat was the moment when the killing reached its highest intensity. Phase 5. The pursuit. The pursuit lasted for days. This is the part of the story that the numbers in the sources are trying to describe, however imprecisely. The Ottoman force did not simply walk south and regroup on the other side of the border. It walked south through an Eastern European winter, on roads it had already stripped of food and fodder coming north, with Moldavian cavalry following at whatever pace the conditions allowed. The temperature at night in that region in January is brutal. Men who were well-fed, well-equipped, and moving in organized formation had a chance of surviving a multi-day winter march. Men who were exhausted, many of them wounded, many of them separated from their units, moving through an unfamiliar landscape without reliable food, were dying by the hour. Cold kills, hunger weakens. Weakness causes falls. Falls in winter, when you cannot stop to rest and cannot find shelter, kill. There is no reliable count of Ottoman dead from the Battle of Vaslui and its aftermath. The sources that exist, Moldavian chronicles, letters from Stephen himself, accounts from neighbouring Christian kingdoms, were written by people who had every reason to make the numbers as large as possible. Modern historians generally accept that the Ottoman losses were severe enough to constitute a decisive operational defeat, enough that the force Suleiman brought into Moldavia could no longer function as a coherent military instrument. But the specific figures have to be treated with skepticism. What is not in dispute is the outcome. An Ottoman army had entered Moldavia with the objective of removing Stephen and restoring Ottoman authority over a rebellious tributary. The army did not achieve its objective. It was defeated in detail, pursued, and suffered losses that left it unable to complete its mission or to threaten Moldavia again in the immediate term. Suleiman Pasha survived. He made it back to Ottoman territory. He would not be lucky enough to escape the consequences. Accounts from the period suggest he was severely punished by Mehmed II for the catastrophe at Vaslui, though whether this took the form of execution or removal from his position is not clear from the sources. History recorded his entry into the Racova Valley. It had little to say about what came after. For Stephen, the pursuit was both a military necessity and a message. Every Ottoman soldier who was not allowed to retreat cleanly and regroup was one fewer soldier who could return with Mehmed's next army. But beyond the tactical rationale, the pursuit signalled something to everyone watching, to the boyars in his own country, to the kings in Hungary and Poland, to the Sultan in Constantinople, that what had happened in the Racova Valley was not an accident, not a lucky morning, not the result of weather. It was what happened when someone had planned everything correctly. The fog burned off by midday. When it did, the Racova Valley was visible for the first time since before dawn, and what was visible was not the kind of thing that gets described in official dispatches or diplomatic letters. It was the reality of what an ambush in confined terrain actually produces when one side has spent weeks preparing and the other side walked in unprepared. We do not have a first-person account of what the valley looked like on the afternoon of January 10th. We have numbers that are disputed, summaries that are exaggerated, and the silence where objective reporting should be. What we can infer from the logic of what happened and from comparable engagements in medieval military history is that the aftermath of a successful ambush in that terrain, with that weather, with that many men involved, was not a scene anyone would want to describe in detail to a civilian audience. The farmers and craftsmen of the Ostiamare, the men who had spent a freezing night in the forest waiting, were now walking through the aftermath of what they had done. Many of them had never been in a battle. Some of them had killed men that day, specific individual men, within arm's reach, not the abstract enemy of a distant military campaign, but a person whose face they had seen. This is something that military histories tend to pass over in a single sentence. The word casualties abstracts the individual deaths into a statistic. The statistic is useful for understanding scale. It is entirely useless for understanding what it felt like to be there. There were Moldavian dead too. How many is unknown. Significantly fewer than the Ottomans, given the nature of the engagement. Moldavia had chosen the ground, had the advantage of surprise, had positioned its archers before the battle began. But they were not zero. Every man who did not come home from the Racova Valley was someone's son, someone's father. The Ostiamare did not provide soldiers who had signed up for permanent military service and understood attrition as part of the job. It provided people who had left their farms and workshops weeks earlier and expected to come back. Some of them did not. Stephen did not rest. By the accounts we have, he was already writing letters before the last Ottoman soldiers had cleared the southern end of the valley. He wrote to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. He wrote to Casimir of Poland. He wrote to Sixtus IV in Rome. The letters described what had happened with the numerical claims that contemporary sources were given to making, and they asked, directly and without much diplomacy, what the recipients intended to do about it. Here is what he told them, in essence. I have just stopped the Ottoman advance that you refuse to help me stop. I have done it alone. I am going to need help before they come back. Because they will come back. And the next time Mehmed II is not going to send a subordinate. Pope Sixtus IV responded with a title. He called Stephen Athleta Christi the champion of Christ. It was a genuine honor in the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the 15th century. It came with letters of commendation and declarations of Stephen's heroism addressed to the rulers of Christendom. It did not come with soldiers. King Matthias of Hungary sent congratulations. He acknowledged the victory, praised Stephen's courage, and noted the importance of Moldavian resistance to Ottoman expansion. He did not move his army. King Casimir of Poland expressed his admiration. He noted the significance of what had happened. He made encouraging sounds about the possibility of future cooperation. No one came. This was not surprising to Stephen. He had, after all, asked before the battle and been given the same non-answer. He had written his letters, knowing the likely response. He sent them anyway, partly out of genuine hope that success would motivate what threat had failed to motivate, and partly because the letters themselves were a form of communication to the Muslim world, to the Christian world, to his own boyars, to the Ottoman court that said, I am here, I am capable, I am not finished. In Constantinople, Mehmed II received the news of Vaslui with a reaction that the Ottoman sources do not record in detail, which itself tells you something. Ottoman imperial chronicles were comprehensive documents. They recorded victories extensively. They had a notable tendency to record defeats briefly, or not at all, or in language that minimized what had happened. The sparse documentation of Vaslui in Ottoman sources is a form of evidence. You do not fail to write about things that did not matter. What we know from subsequent events is that Mehmed's response was not passive. He did not send another subordinate with another punitive force. He began planning a campaign that he would lead himself, with forces large enough that a morning's fog and a well-chosen valley would not be sufficient to stop them. He had been beaten. He understood how he had been beaten. And he intended to return with something that could not be beaten the same way. The year was 1475. Stephen had won the most complete and unexpected military victory in Moldavian history. He had earned the admiration of the Christian world. He had demonstrated that the Ottoman war machine, for all its power, had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a commander who understood them. And he knew with the same cold clarity that had designed the trap in the Racova Valley that it would not be enough. Mehmed was coming back. The summer of 1476 arrived earlier than anyone in Moldavia wanted it to. Mehmed II crossed into Moldavia in July with a force vastly larger than what Suleiman had brought. This time Mehmed had studied what had happened at Vaslui. He was not going to march a column into a narrow valley in the fog. He was going to use overwhelming numbers and scorched earth of his own strip the land ahead of him, deny Stephen the terrain advantages he had exploited so effectively, and force a confrontation on terms that favored Ottoman strength. Stephen could not fight that battle. He knew it. He did not try. Instead, he applied the same logic he had applied before Vaslui, but in reverse. If the Ottomans wanted to use his land, he would make sure there was nothing worth using. The Moldavian population retreated north. Grain stores were burned. Wells were contaminated. Livestock were driven away. The Ottoman army moved through Moldavia that summer and found a country that offered them nothing except the possibility of dying slowly from hunger and disease in a hostile landscape with no clear end. Mehmed captured some territory. He won several engagements when he could force them. He did not capture or destroy Stephen's army. And in the late summer, with his supply lines stretched and disease beginning to run through his camp, he withdrew. Moldavia survived. not unscathed. The 1476 campaign caused enormous damage, villages burned, populations displaced, crops destroyed. The human cost was severe in ways that do not show up in military casualty figures. But the state survived, the army survived. Stephen survived. He would continue to survive for nearly 30 more years. Stephen III of Moldavia reigned until 1504, 47 years in total, one of the longest reigns in medieval European history, and almost certainly the most consequential in Moldavian history. In the decades after Vaslui, he continued to fight against the Ottomans, against the Tatars, against Hungarian incursions, against the endless pressure of being a small state at the intersection of large ambitions. He won more than he lost. He built churches after major victories, a tradition that was both genuine religious devotion and a form of political communication, a statement to his people that the fight was worth fighting because what they were protecting had value beyond the military. Many of those churches still stand. In 2003, UNESCO inscribed 8 of them on the World Heritage List stone buildings from the 15th and early 16th centuries, in a style that is distinctly Moldavian, that survived 550 years of invasion, empire, communism, and the ordinary grinding erosion of time. They are still there in what is now northeastern Romania. You can visit them. Stephen died in 1504, still Prince of Moldavia, still sovereign over the principality he had spent his life defending. He had not solved the Ottoman problem, no one had, and it would not be solved for another century and a half. After his death, Moldavia gradually became an Ottoman tributary in the more complete sense, less autonomous, more constrained, eventually part of the Ottoman system in a way that Stephen had spent his life resisting. But he had bought his people something real. Decades, generations, time. Now, why don't you know this story? Why, if you asked 100 educated Americans to name a medieval military victory against the Ottomans, would 95 of them say Lepanto, the naval battle of 1571, fought by Venice and Spain before they would say Vaslui? Why does Lepanto have paintings in the Vatican, and Vaslui has almost nothing in Western memory? Part of the answer is language. The chronicles that recorded Vaslui were written in Church Slavonic and in Moldavian Romanian languages that were not read in London or Paris or Florence. The letters Stephen wrote in Latin reached Western courts, but the detailed accounts of what happened in the Racova Valley did not circulate in the European scholarly networks that produced the histories that shaped how the educated West understood the 15th century. Part of the answer is geography. Vaslui happened at what Western Europeans thought of as the edge of the world. Moldavia was peripheral, not a great kingdom, not a recognized power, not part of the story that Western civilization was telling about itself. Venice mattered because Venice was wealthy and connected. Moldavia did not have those connections. And part of the answer is what this says about how history is recorded more broadly. History is not a neutral account of everything that happened. It is a collection of stories told by people with access to resources, literacy, and audiences. The stories that get told are not always the most important ones. They are the ones told by people positioned to tell them. Stephen the Great was enormously famous in his own world. He was celebrated in neighboring Orthodox Christian communities. The Orthodox Church eventually canonized him. In Romania and Moldova today, he is the kind of figure that Americans might compare to George Washington, the founding hero, the man who defined what his nation was capable of. In Western European history, he is a footnote. This asymmetry matters, not as a grievance history cannot be changed, but as a reminder that the stories we know are a selection, and the selection was made by forces that had nothing to do with importance or merit. The Battle of Vaslui in 1475 was, by any reasonable military assessment, one of the more remarkable engagements of the 15th century. A smaller, less equipped force defeated a professional army of significantly greater size through a combination of intelligence, terrain selection, logistical sabotage, psychological warfare, and disciplined execution. The commander who designed it went on to govern his principality for nearly 50 years and was still fighting on his deathbed. None of that is why he is remembered where he is remembered. He is remembered because his people survived, and because surviving people can keep their own stories alive even when no one else is telling them. Here is the thing about the Racova Valley. The title of this video promised you a battle where 20,000 soldiers used fog to trap, ambush, and destroy an Ottoman army of 80,000. And that is, roughly, what the sources say happened. But the more you understand about what actually occurred on January 10th, 1475, the more the fog becomes almost incidental. The fog was real. The fog helped. In the calculus of that morning, fog tipped several variables in Stephen's favor that might otherwise have balanced differently. But Stephen did not need the fog to win. He needed the fog to win as completely as he did. The trap was built before the fog arrived. The terrain was chosen before the fog arrived. The archers were in position before the fog arrived. The Ottoman army was already committed to the valley before the fog arrived. Every element that made the battle decisive was in place before a single particle of water vapor condensed over the Racova River. The fog was the last brushstroke. The painting was already done. What Stephen actually did, what the Battle of Vaslui actually demonstrates, is something more durable and more transferable than a lucky weather event. He identified the specific gap between what an enemy believed about itself and what was actually true. The Ottoman army believed it was invincible. It had been invincible, in the conditions it was used to operating in for decades. Stephen's insight was that invincibility is conditional. It exists relative to a specific set of circumstances, and if you can eliminate those circumstances, you can eliminate the invincibility. He did not have better soldiers. He did not have better weapons. He did not have more men, or more money, or more allies. He had a clear-eyed assessment of reality and the willingness to act on it completely, without hedging, without looking for a safer option. The valley near Vaslui, in what is now eastern Romania, is a quiet place today. The Racova River still runs through it. There is forest on both sides, though thinner than it was 5 centuries ago. In January, on cold mornings, fog still collects in the low ground. There is no large monument at the site of the battle, no extensive commemoration in the Western calendars, a local museum, a statue in the nearby city. The memory lives most vividly in the country where the battle happened, among the descendants of the people who were in that forest. Stephen the Great fought his whole life to keep those people alive. He succeeded. And because he succeeded, the story survived too imperfectly, in sources that not everyone reads, in a language that not everyone speaks, but alive. He won a battle in the fog on January 10th, 1475. But what he actually won was something harder to map and harder to see than a winter valley on a medieval morning. He won the right for his people to keep telling their own story. That, in the end, is what Vaslui was actually about. Dedict Logo.